"You have shamed me before officers of the crown, Eleanor. By morning you will leave this house." The Duke of Ashbourne did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every officer gathered around the long dining table heard him clearly, and every servant, standing against the paneled walls, suddenly found something fascinating to study on the floor. Duchess Eleanor Ashbourne remained beside the maps she had spread before them. 3 years of marriage had taught her that her husband's anger was most dangerous when his voice became quiet. "I asked you to delay the convoy, Julian, nothing more. You contradicted me in front of Colonel Wycliffe. Because Colonel Wycliffe is sending 200 men north with medicine for fewer than 50. Julian's jaw tightened. Eleanor pointed toward the figures she had written beside the proposed route. 38 supply wagons were promised. 23 have arrived. Half the flour delivered yesterday is damp. There are not enough blankets, and the medical crates listed here have never reached Ashbourne." Lord Percival Vane, Julian's cousin, leaned back in his chair. Unlike the uniformed officers, Percival wore an immaculate dark blue evening coat. Since war had drawn Julian increasingly into government circles, Percival had become indispensable in London, handling contracts, purchasing supplies, negotiating loans, and assuring Julian that everything was under control. "My dear Eleanor," Percival said gently, "war is rarely as tidy as household accounts." Several officers smiled. Eleanor felt the humiliation, but she refused to lower her eyes. "My father served as an army surgeon for 17 years. I spent half my childhood watching him calculate how many bandages, meals, and doses of laudanum wounded men required. A soldier cannot eat promises, Lord Percival." Julian struck the table with his palm. "That is enough." Silence swallowed the room. Eleanor looked at her husband. Once, Julian had admired precisely this part of her. During their first year of marriage, he had brought neglected estate ledgers to her after supper and laughed in astonishment when she discovered why one of his farms continually lost money. He used to call her his clearest mind. Now the same intelligence embarrassed him. "The men leave Wednesday," Julian said. "They may die because no one here wishes to admit the supplies are missing. And you," he replied coldly, "see disaster because you are frightened of everything war requires." Something inside Eleanor went still. "Do you believe caution is cowardice? I believe my Duchess should strengthen confidence in my decisions, not undermine them publicly." There it was. Not concern for the soldiers. Not even disagreement over the numbers. Pride. Julian rolled up the map. "You will go to Hawthorne Grange tomorrow. Remain there until I decide otherwise." Eleanor stared at him for several seconds. "If that is your decision, Your Grace." It was the first time in years she had addressed her husband by his title inside their own home. Julian noticed. He let her walk away anyway. By noon the following day, Eleanor's carriage was rolling north with 2 trunks and her maid, Margaret. Julian did not come outside to see her leave. Percival did. He stood beside the stone steps while servants secured her luggage, his expression composed almost to the point of kindness. "You should rest in the country," he told her. "Leave military affairs to men accustomed to them." Eleanor climbed into the carriage without answering, but she remembered those words. 3 months later, Hawthorne Grange no longer resembled the quiet country house to which Julian had exiled her. Its drawing room contained 32 wounded soldiers. The dining room contained another 19. Mattresses covered the gallery floor. Linen curtains had been cut into bandages. 2 farm wagons waited continuously at the courtyard entrance to collect injured men from the surrounding roads. Eleanor had slept perhaps 9 hours in 4 days. "Your Grace." She turned. A young soldier was struggling to hold down a feverish man whose bandaged thigh had begun bleeding again. Eleanor crossed the room immediately. "Pressure here. Harder. He'll scream. Better screaming than dying." She pressed folded linen against the wound and looked toward Margaret. "Boiled water, and bring Dr. Mercer." Another voice rose from the doorway. "We have 7 more." Eleanor closed her eyes for half a second. 7. Their food calculations had already been stretched past safety. The battalion had been moving south when its promised provisions failed to arrive. Hunger, infection, and exhaustion had done almost as much damage as battle. Eleanor had responded exactly as her father once had: count everything, waste nothing, and never let panic make decisions. She requisitioned grain from her own stores and paid neighboring farmers from the modest household allowance Julian had left her. She converted the old brewhouse into a kitchen and persuaded a retired apothecary to reopen his shop. Then she mapped every farm between Hawthorne and the Northern Road and created a wagon rotation capable of moving casualties twice as quickly as the army's surviving carts. The officers had stopped questioning her orders after the first week. That evening, Captain Thomas Avery found her sitting on an overturned crate behind the kitchen, calculating tomorrow's flour ration. "You saved another 12 today," he said. Eleanor continued writing. "Dr. Mercer saved them. Dr. Mercer says he would have lost half his patients without the supplies you organized." She finally looked up. Avery's left arm was still bound against his chest, but color had returned to his face. "How many men remain unable to travel?" 87. "Then nobody has been saved yet." Avery studied her with an expression Eleanor had seen increasingly among the soldiers, respect that made her uncomfortable because Julian had sent her here believing she possessed nothing worth respecting. The captain reached inside his coat. "I have something for you." He placed a brass dispatch cylinder on the crate. It was dented and blackened along one side. "Where did you get this?" "Recovered from Quartermaster Bell's wagon." Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. Bell's supply convoy was the one that had never arrived. "He died yesterday," Avery continued. "Before he did, he told me you should see what was inside." Eleanor opened the cylinder. Several documents had survived the fire. She unfolded the first requisition: 200 blankets, 600 pounds of flour, surgical instruments, laudanum, bandages, salted beef, almost everything the stranded soldiers had been missing. Eleanor's gaze moved toward the authorization at the bottom. Her stomach tightened. Stamped beside the signature was the unmistakable crest of Ashbourne. These supplies had been purchased using her husband's authority, yet the regiment had never received them. Eleanor examined the next sheet, then the next. All approved, all paid, all missing. Then she reached the final document. Someone had ordered the shipment diverted before it ever reached the soldiers. Eleanor recognized the signature: Lord Percival Vane. For several seconds, only the distant groans of wounded men could be heard. Captain Avery leaned closer. "Your Grace?" Eleanor slowly folded the paper. Her husband had banished her for questioning missing supplies. And the man Julian had trusted instead was the man whose name now appeared on the order that had made them disappear. But one detail frightened Eleanor even more. The diversion order was dated 6 weeks after she had left London. Whatever Percival was doing had not ended when she was sent away. It had only become easier. Eleanor did not send the document to Julian. 3 months earlier, she would have done so immediately. She would have written a careful letter, explained every discrepancy, and trusted her husband to listen once the evidence was placed before him. But Julian had already been given that opportunity. He had chosen Percival. "Captain Avery, who else knows this cylinder survived?" 2 soldiers helped recover it, neither opened it, and Quartermaster Bell, dead before sunset yesterday. Eleanor folded the diversion order and returned it to the brass case. Then for now, no one else must know what we found. Avery studied her. Including the Duke? Especially until I know what this means. She hated the bitterness of the words, but caution was no longer cowardice to her. It was protection. The next morning Eleanor moved her work into Hawthorne's neglected estate office and began comparing every surviving army document Avery could obtain. She laid requisitions across the desk, arranged them chronologically, and soon found a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. The missing convoy was not the first. 3 shipments of flour had been reduced before delivery. 2 medical consignments contained barely half the quantities recorded on their invoices. 40 blankets had become 17 somewhere between London and the regiment, yet the full amounts had been charged. Every questionable transaction passed through contractors connected to Percival. Eleanor circled the names in ink. "Look at the dates," she told Avery. He leaned over the desk. "They begin after you left London. Most of them do." The implication made her stomach tighten. Percival had not merely profited from wartime confusion. Eleanor's removal from Ashbourne's accounts had given him freedom he had not possessed while she was there. Julian had handed him that freedom. Before they could examine another invoice, Margaret entered quickly. "Your Grace, Colonel Wycliffe has arrived." Eleanor looked up. "The same Colonel Wycliffe?" "Yes." The man before whom Julian had humiliated her 3 months earlier entered Hawthorne's courtyard 10 minutes later and stopped beneath the archway. For once, Colonel Edmund Wycliffe had nothing to say. Soldiers occupied almost every visible corner of the estate. A carpenter was constructing additional bedsteads beside the stable. Villagers carried baskets toward the kitchens. 2 recovered soldiers were loading sacks of flour onto wagons, using Eleanor's allocation lists. And as the colonel walked toward the house, men began removing their caps when Eleanor appeared. "Your Grace." "Colonel." His eyes moved toward the improvised hospital behind her. "I was told you had assisted several wounded men. 316 have passed through Hawthorne." The colonel's expression changed. 316. Avery appeared beside her. "Without her Grace, sir, I doubt half of us would be alive." Eleanor saw Wycliffe absorb the statement without answering. He had laughed when Julian called her frightened. Now surviving soldiers stood around him because she had been right. "I came to retrieve those fit for service," Wycliffe finally said. "You may take 63 today. Another 30 should travel within the week." "You determined that?" "Dr. Mercer did. I determined whether you have enough food and transport to move them without returning them to my infirmary." A few soldiers nearby concealed smiles. Wycliffe did not, but neither did he challenge her. Instead, he reached into his coat. "There is another matter." He handed Eleanor a letter, bearing the Duke of Ashbourne's seal. For one foolish heartbeat, she wondered whether Julian had finally written to apologize. She broke the wax. "There was no apology. Eleanor, Lord Percival informs me that wartime expenses have placed unusual demands upon the estate. Hawthorne's household allowance will therefore be reduced by half, effective immediately. You will dismiss unnecessary servants and refrain from extraordinary purchases without authorization. I expect your cooperation, Ashbourne." Eleanor read it twice. Behind her, wounded soldiers were eating soup purchased with money Julian had just ordered her not to spend. "When was this written?" she asked. 4 days ago, Wycliffe replied. Avery saw her expression. "What is it?" Eleanor handed him the letter. His face hardened. "They are cutting your funds?" "By half." Wycliffe looked uncomfortable. Ashbourne may not understand what is happening here. He chose not to. Eleanor immediately regretted saying it aloud, but she would not withdraw the truth. That afternoon she calculated Hawthorne's remaining money. At the new allowance, they could keep the hospital functioning for perhaps 11 days, 12 if she dismissed servants, 9 if another group of casualties arrived. Eleanor stared at the figures until Margaret entered carrying an unopened envelope. This came from London with the Colonel's post. The handwriting belonged to Mr. Samuel Finch, an elderly solicitor who had managed Eleanor's marriage settlement before Julian replaced him with one of Percival's associates. She opened it. "Your Grace, forgive the secrecy of this correspondence. I believe you should know that Lord Percival Vane has presented documents seeking authority over several Ashbourne properties as security for wartime obligations. His Grace has signed preliminary instruments. One property named is Hawthorne Grange." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the paper. There was more. A substantial loan appears to have been taken against the estate. I cannot reconcile the sum with any legitimate expenditure known to me. More troubling still, your marriage settlement may have been used to strengthen the security. Eleanor stopped reading. Her marriage settlement. Property and income intended to protect her future had somehow become entangled in Percival's borrowing. Avery watched her face. What happened? Eleanor handed him the letter. He read it, then looked toward the crowded infirmary. If Percival takes Hawthorne, these men lose their hospital, and you lose your home. Eleanor looked through the window at soldiers crossing the courtyard on crutches. Julian had sent her here to remove an embarrassment from his sight. Percival was now preparing to take even this place from her. Yet anger could wait. Evidence could not. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. "I need every military requisition you can obtain, every supplier's name, every quantity ordered, and every quantity actually received." Avery nodded. "I can ask the surviving quartermasters. Do not tell them why." Then Eleanor turned to Margaret. "Send someone to the village for Mr. Finch. Your solicitor is in London. Then prepare the carriage." Margaret stared at her. "You are going to London?" Eleanor looked at Julian's cold letter lying beside Percival's diversion order. "No." She folded both documents into the brass cylinder. "I am going wherever the missing supplies went first." Before nightfall, Captain Avery returned with one final discovery. The Army records showed the diverted convoy had never traveled north at all. Its wagons had been sent to a private warehouse near the River Thames, and the warehouse was scheduled to be emptied in 48 hours. Eleanor left Hawthorne before dawn with Captain Avery, Margaret, and 2 soldiers strong enough to travel. The brass dispatch cylinder remained hidden beneath her cloak, while copies of the requisitions were sewn into the lining of Margaret's traveling bag. If Percival discovered what she possessed, losing the evidence would be far more dangerous than losing the warehouse. By the following evening, they reached the outskirts of London. Eleanor did not return to Ashbourne House. Instead, Avery led them toward the Thames, where warehouses crowded the riverbank and carts moved between narrow lanes blackened by coal smoke. They stopped opposite the address written on the diversion order, Vane and Mercer Trading. Eleanor stared at the sign. "Mercer? No relation to your doctor, I assume," Avery said. "None." More important was what stood beneath it. Army wagons, 4 of them. Men were loading wooden crates onto civilian carts, and Eleanor recognized the markings immediately: flour, medical spirits, blankets, preserved meat. Supplies purchased for soldiers were being moved into private commerce. "We need witnesses," Eleanor whispered. Avery's anger sharpened. "We could call the constable now, and Percival will produce papers claiming everything is legitimate. By morning the records will disappear. She watched another crate leave the warehouse. We find the records first. Avery turned toward her. You intend to enter? I intend to ask questions. You are the Duchess of Ashbourne. Someone will recognize you. Then they will assume I have every right to be here. The confidence in her voice surprised even Eleanor. Less than 4 months earlier, Julian's public contempt had made her question whether she had mistaken stubbornness for competence. Hawthorne had answered that question. Men were alive because she had trusted what she knew. She crossed the street. A clerk appeared before she reached the doors. This warehouse is closed to visitors. Eleanor did not slow. Then open it. The young man blinked. I beg your pardon? Duchess of Ashbourne. His face lost color. Eleanor extended one hand without introducing Avery. I require the inventory records for all goods purchased under the Ashbourne seal. I would need Mr. Gresham's authority. Then fetch Mr. Gresham. 5 minutes later, a heavy-set warehouse manager hurried from an office. Your Grace, this is unexpected. I imagine it is. His nervousness confirmed more than any denial could have. Eleanor walked past him. Hundreds of crates filled the warehouse, enough food and medicine to have prevented much of what she had witnessed at Hawthorne. She stopped beside one stamped with a military destination code. This belongs to Colonel Wycliffe's regiment. Gresham swallowed. There must be some mistake. Eleanor opened the manifest attached to the crate. The serial number matched one of Quartermaster Bell's missing consignments. No mistake. Avery stepped closer. Gresham's eyes fell upon his uniform and the sling supporting his arm. For the first time he looked frightened. Who ordered the diversion? Eleanor asked. I merely manage storage. Then your records will tell me. The ledgers are confidential. Eleanor looked directly at him. These goods were purchased under my husband's authority, partially secured against estates whose accounts I administered until 3 months ago. You may show me the ledger voluntarily, Mr. Gresham, or explain to the army why wounded soldiers nearly starved while their provisions sat inside your warehouse. Gresham hesitated. That was enough. A crash sounded from the rear office. Avery turned immediately. Someone is running. One soldier rushed toward the back exit. Eleanor entered the office and found papers scattered across a desk. The main ledger was gone, but whoever had fled had left an invoice book open beside the inkstand. She began turning pages. Military supplies had been purchased using Ashbourne credit, transferred to Vane and Mercer, then resold to civilian buyers at inflated wartime prices. The same goods were effectively being paid for twice, once by the estate, again by private customers. Eleanor found a column marked Commissions, P.V. Percival Vane, but another notation appeared repeatedly beside the largest transactions, A.H. Her heart sank. Ashbourne. If that abbreviation meant what it appeared to mean, Percival could claim Julian knew everything. Perhaps Julian had signed more than preliminary documents. Perhaps her husband was not merely foolish. Avery saw where she was looking. Do you believe the Duke is involved? I don't know. That answer hurt more than Eleanor expected. She could no longer defend Julian simply because she had once loved him. They copied as many pages as possible, while Avery ordered one soldier to fetch Colonel Wycliffe. Gresham protested until Eleanor showed him the original diversion order bearing Percival's signature. Then he became very quiet. Lord Vane said His Grace approved everything, he whispered. Did you ever receive instructions directly from my husband? No. Did you see his signature? On several financial instruments. Originals? Gresham hesitated. I cannot say. Eleanor leaned closer. Where is the main ledger? Before he could answer, Heavy footsteps approached outside. For an instant, Eleanor expected Avery's soldier to return with military officers. Instead, 6 men entered. At their center stood Lord Percival Vane. He removed his gloves slowly. Eleanor. No surprise appeared on his face, only irritation. You were supposed to remain at Hawthorne. Eleanor closed the invoice book, and these supplies were supposed to reach wounded soldiers. Percival glanced at Avery, then at the papers. You have wandered into affairs you do not understand. I understand that men were bleeding on my floors while you sold their medicine. Percival's expression hardened. You should be very careful with accusations. Why? Will Julian banish me twice? Something flickered behind his eyes. Then he smiled. No, but your husband may do considerably worse when he discovers you interfered with transactions carrying his signature. Percival reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He placed it before Eleanor. At the bottom was Julian's unmistakable signature. Above it was an authorization granting Percival broad power to dispose of wartime goods and raise loans against several Ashbourne properties, including Hawthorne. Eleanor forced herself to read every line. Then she noticed the date. Her breathing stopped. The document had supposedly been signed in London on the 17th of June. She remembered that day perfectly. Julian had not been in London. He had been with her at Ashbourne Castle, nearly 100 miles away, attending the funeral of one of his oldest tenants. Eleanor slowly raised her eyes. Percival was still smiling. He believed the signature would silence her. Instead, he had just shown her the first piece of evidence that could destroy him. Before Eleanor could speak, the warehouse doors slammed shut behind them. The 6 men spread across the warehouse entrance, but Eleanor did not move from the desk. Percival mistook her silence for fear. You have taken documents belonging to a private company, he said. Give them to me. Return to Hawthorne, and I may persuade Julian to overlook this. Eleanor touched the authorization lying before her. You said Julian signed this? Of course. On the 17th of June? Percival's smile thinned. That is what the document says. Eleanor remembered that day clearly. The church bell at Ashbourne Village, Julian standing beside her during old Mr. Talbot's funeral, then remaining at the estate until after midnight with the tenant's grieving family. He could not have signed anything in London. She concealed the realization. Then I suppose Julian will confirm it himself. Percival stepped closer. You will not involve him. That was the first mistake he made aloud. Avery shifted between them. Open the doors. Percival glanced toward the armed men. Captain, I suggest you remember that you are interfering with the lawful business of a duke. I remember men starving because someone stole their food. One of Percival's men reached for Avery. Eleanor raised her voice. Touch an officer of His Majesty's army inside a warehouse filled with stolen military supplies. Please, I would be fascinated to hear how you explain it. The man stopped. Percival's composure finally cracked. You always believed yourself cleverer than everyone around you. No, only clever enough to count. She lifted the invoice book. And your numbers are very bad. Outside a whistle sounded, then another. Percival turned toward the doors. A heavy pounding followed. Open in the king's name. Colonel Wycliffe had arrived. Percival swore under his breath. His men hesitated, and Avery immediately crossed the warehouse and pulled back the bolt. Wycliffe entered with 8 soldiers and a government supply officer. The colonel looked around at the military crates. His face hardened. What is this? Eleanor handed him Quartermaster Bell's diversion order. Supplies your regiment was supposed to receive. Wycliffe read Percival's signature and looked up. Seal the warehouse. Percival stepped forward. "You have no authority," then complained to the War Office. Soldiers moved toward every exit. For the next hour, crates were counted, while the government officer compared their numbers with Eleanor's copied requisitions. Each match strengthened the case. Blankets reported delivered were stacked against the east wall. Medical spirits, supposedly lost in transit, sat unopened. Food purchased for soldiers had been marked for resale. Wycliffe eventually approached Eleanor. "You were right at Ashbourne." She looked at him. He seemed uncomfortable saying it. "I should have listened. So should my husband." Wycliffe had no answer to that. By midnight, Percival had been permitted to leave only because the authorization bearing Julian's signature complicated any immediate arrest. Before departing, he stopped beside Eleanor. "You think you have won something. I think soldiers will receive their supplies. You should worry about yourself." He leaned nearer. "Julian signed more papers than you know." Eleanor watched him leave without replying. The warning followed her back to Mr. Finch's small London office, where the elderly solicitor examined copies of the warehouse documents until nearly 2 in the morning. When Eleanor showed him the authorization dated June 17th, he adjusted his spectacles. "You are certain His Grace was at Ashbourne that day? Dozens of people saw him. Then this signature may be forged." "Maybe." Finch placed 2 genuine letters from Julian beside the authorization. "The hand is exceptionally close." Eleanor studied them. Then she saw the difference. Julian always dragged the final stroke of the A in Ashbourne downward. On Percival's document, it curved upward. Small, almost invisible, but wrong. Finch opened another file. "There is worse." He showed Eleanor 3 loans taken against Ashbourne property during her exile. Julian had genuinely signed the first, giving Percival limited authority to raise wartime funds. Percival had apparently used that legitimate document as the foundation for everything that followed. Eleanor felt the truth settle heavily inside her. Julian had not created the fraud, but he had opened the door. He had dismissed her warnings, removed her from the accounts, trusted Percival without supervision, and signed away authority because questioning his cousin would have required admitting his wife might be right. "Can Hawthorne still be protected?" she asked. Finch hesitated. "If we act immediately." A pounding suddenly shook the office door. Margaret entered, holding a message delivered from Hawthorne. Eleanor broke the seal. Her blood went cold. Another military column had reached the estate, more than 100 wounded men, and that afternoon an agent representing Ashbourne's creditors had arrived with instructions to inventory Hawthorne Grange for seizure. The hospital was now full, and Eleanor had 3 days before Percival's creditors could close it. Eleanor did not return to bed. Before dawn, she had already drafted 3 letters. One to Colonel Wycliffe requesting temporary military protection for Hawthorne, one to the War Office documenting the seized supplies, and one to Julian. The last was only 4 sentences. "Come to Hawthorne before the creditors take possession. Bring every document you signed granting Percival Vane financial authority. If you destroy nothing and alter nothing, there may still be time to save the estate. This is no longer about our marriage. Eleanor Ashbourne." She sealed it without adding, "your wife." By afternoon, Eleanor was traveling back toward Hawthorne with Avery, while Mr. Finch remained in London to challenge the seizure. The journey took more than a day, and when their carriage finally reached the estate road, they found villagers gathered outside the gates. 3 unfamiliar carriages stood in the courtyard, creditors. Eleanor stepped down before the coach fully stopped. A gray-haired man approached with two clerks. Duchess of Ashbourne? Yes. Henry Cole. I represent Barrow and Kent, under authority granted by His Grace. You may inventory furniture. Cole blinked. You may inspect the land, Eleanor continued, walking past him, but you will not remove a bed, blanket, cooking vessel, medicine chest, or quantity of food currently being used by wounded soldiers. My instructions. Your instructions are based partly upon instruments now under investigation for forgery. That stopped him. Avery handed Cole a copy of Colonel Wycliffe's seizure notice concerning the London warehouse. If you interfere with military patients, Avery said, your firm may explain itself to the War Office. Within 20 minutes, the creditor's men had withdrawn to the unused West Wing. Eleanor barely had time to breathe before Dr. Mercer met her at the entrance. We lost 2 men this morning. Her victory disappeared instantly. How many critical? 17. Food? 5 days. Medicine? Better. Colonel Wycliffe sent supplies from the recovered warehouse. Eleanor looked toward the courtyard, where crates Percival had stolen were finally being unloaded for the men who needed them. Then a soldier noticed her. Her Grace is back. Another man raised himself from a bench. The Duchess. The call spread. Soldiers appeared at windows and doorways, some bandaged, some leaning on crutches. One lifted his cap, then another. Within seconds, dozens were standing. Eleanor stopped. God save the woman who saved us, someone shouted. The courtyard erupted. She had been exiled here as a coward. Now soldiers were cheering her name. A carriage entered through the gates while the sound was still rising. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Ashbourne. Julian stepped down. He looked exhausted, furious, and confused. Then he saw the soldiers. A young infantryman near him asked, "You here to see the Duchess, sir?" Julian stared at Eleanor across the courtyard. "I am her husband." The soldier's expression changed. So did those around him. Word had apparently traveled regarding why Eleanor had come to Hawthorne. Julian crossed the courtyard beneath a silence far crueler than open accusation. Inside the library, Eleanor closed the door. "You came. You told me my signature was forged." "Was it?" She placed Percival's authorization before him. Julian examined it. "I signed an instrument giving Percival limited authority. Not this one. No. Where is the original?" "With Percival." Eleanor gave a humorless laugh. "Of course it is." Julian stiffened. "I trusted my cousin." "And refused to trust your wife." "Eleanor, no. We will discuss that when men are no longer in danger of losing their hospital." She placed the warehouse invoices beside his authorization. Julian's face changed as he read. "He resold them? After your estate paid for them. That cannot—" "It can." It did. Julian lowered himself into a chair. For perhaps the first time, Eleanor saw him understand that Percival's crimes were not something done entirely behind his back. Julian had given him access, authority, reputation, and protection. "I signed the first loan," he admitted quietly. Percival said additional funds were necessary for government contracts. "How much?" Julian hesitated. £20,000. Eleanor went cold. That amount never appeared in the estate accounts. His silence confirmed that he had not checked. Before she could speak again, the library door opened abruptly. Captain Avery entered carrying a leather portfolio. "Your Grace, Colonel Wycliffe has arrived from London." "Already?" He brought the main warehouse ledger. Eleanor stood. Avery's expression warned her something was wrong. Percival kept 2 sets of accounts. Julian rose as well. One for the authorities, and one recording the real division of profits. Avery placed the ledger on the table and opened it near the final pages. Percival's initials appeared repeatedly beside large sums, then Julian's. J.A. Julian Ashbourne stared at them. I never received this money. Eleanor turned another page. A name appeared beneath his initials. Someone who had collected the payments personally on Julian's behalf. She had seen that name before, not in Percival's papers, in her own household accounts. Eleanor looked up sharply. The man receiving Julian's supposed share was still living at Hawthorne Grange, and at that very moment he had unrestricted access to more than 100 wounded soldiers. Ban Común toi Viettief van Bijham, Part 5. Mr. Finch took the message from Eleanor and read it twice. 3 days, he murmured. Percival is moving faster than I expected. Can he legally seize Hawthorne? Not if we prove the later instruments were forged, but the first loan carries His Grace's genuine signature, and that gives the creditors enough uncertainty to act before a court decides otherwise. Eleanor looked at the documents covering his desk. Then we do not wait for the court. Finch raised an eyebrow. We prove the fraud tonight. They began with June 17th. Julian's supposed authorization placed him in London that afternoon. Eleanor knew he had attended Mr. Talbot's funeral at Ashbourne, but her memory alone would accomplish little. Finch sent a clerk to locate the church register and another messenger to the coaching company that served Ashbourne. Near midnight, the first answer arrived. The Reverend Matthew Hale had recorded Julian's presence at the funeral. More importantly, Julian had signed the burial register as a witness. Finch placed a copy beside Percival's document. 2 signatures attributed to the same man, supposedly made nearly 100 miles apart within 3 hours. Impossible. Precisely. The second messenger brought something even stronger. Road records showed no Ashbourne carriage entering London that day. Percival's authorization was beginning to collapse, but Finch remained troubled. He still possesses the genuine document Julian originally signed. How much authority did it grant? That is what worries me. Without the original, we rely on Julian's description of its limits. Eleanor's expression hardened. Then we need Julian. For months she had imagined seeing her husband again. Sometimes she imagined anger, sometimes an apology she no longer believed would come. Now she felt neither. Julian had become a necessary witness, nothing more. A knock sounded downstairs. Avery entered moments later with Colonel Wycliffe. The colonel carried a sealed portfolio. We completed the warehouse inventory. He placed the report on Finch's desk. The quantities are worse than we believed. Supplies intended for 4 separate military formations were diverted. Eleanor scanned the figures. Hundreds of blankets, thousands of pounds of food. Medical equipment, enough to explain shortages far beyond Hawthorne. Any deaths connected to those shortages? She asked quietly. Wycliffe hesitated. Yes. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Percival had stolen money. Julian's arrogance had helped him steal something far more valuable. Time, food, medicine, lives. Wycliffe continued. There is also evidence someone inside Ashbourne's household communicated convoy schedules to the warehouse. Eleanor looked up. Who? We do not know. He produced several copied messages. None contained a full name, only initials and delivery instructions. One repeated mark appeared at the bottom. J.A. Julian Ashbourne. Avery swore softly. Eleanor did not. Those initials are too convenient. Wycliffe watched her carefully. You are defending your husband? No, I am defending evidence. She placed Percival's forged authorization beside the messages. If Percival can imitate Julian's signature, he can certainly write 2 letters. It was a distinction Eleanor refused to surrender. Julian was responsible for what he had actually done, silencing her, abandoning oversight, granting Percival authority, and refusing to investigate warnings. She would not accuse him of crimes without proof merely because he had hurt her. Finch nodded approvingly. Then we need the original correspondence. Where would it be? Percival's private accounts. Avery looked toward Wycliffe. Not the warehouse? The colonel shook his head. We searched it. The principal ledger was removed before we arrived. Eleanor remembered the crash from the rear office and the clerk who had fled. Someone had carried the most dangerous record away minutes before Percival entered. Find that clerk, she said. Avery nodded immediately. Finch then opened Eleanor's marriage settlement. There may be one way to delay Hawthorne's seizure. His finger stopped beside a provision concerning property assigned for Eleanor's maintenance. Hawthorne's annual income was specifically reserved for your use if the Duke ceased providing suitable residence or support. Eleanor stared at him. Julian sent me there himself. Yes. And then reduced my allowance. Yes. Finch's expression changed slowly. Which means Percival may have made a serious mistake. The very letter reducing your allowance could help establish that Hawthorne's income had become part of your protected maintenance. Eleanor reached into her case. Julian's letter was still there. The punishment meant to weaken her had accidentally given Finch the argument needed to defend the hospital. For the first time that night, Eleanor almost smiled. Then Avery appeared at the office doorway again. His expression erased it. We found the warehouse clerk. Where? Dead near the river. Silence filled the room. He drowned? Wycliffe asked. Avery shook his head. Someone struck him before he entered the water. Eleanor looked toward the ledger copies. Percival was no longer merely protecting stolen money. He was destroying witnesses. And Hawthorne, filled with soldiers who could testify to the consequences of his scheme, was now 3 days from falling into his hands. Eleanor pushed back her chair. Then we protect the living witnesses before he reaches them. She turned toward Finch. Bring me paper. There would be no sleep that night. Eleanor did not return to bed. Before dawn, she had written 3 letters, one requesting military protection for Hawthorne, one documenting the warehouse fraud for the War Office, and one to Julian. Come to Hawthorne before the creditors take possession. Bring every document you signed, granting Percival authority. Destroy nothing and alter nothing. This is no longer about our marriage. Eleanor Ashbourne. She sealed it without writing, your wife. By afternoon, Eleanor and Avery were traveling back toward Hawthorne, while Finch remained in London to challenge the seizure. When they finally reached the estate, unfamiliar carriages crowded the courtyard, and creditors' clerks were already inspecting the property. A gray-haired man approached. Duchess of Ashbourne, Henry Cole, representing Barrow and Kent. Under authority granted by His Grace, you may inspect the unused rooms and land, Eleanor interrupted, but you will remove nothing being used by wounded soldiers. My instructions permit. Your instructions depend partly upon documents now under investigation for forgery. Avery handed him Colonel Wycliffe's notice concerning the recovered military supplies. If your men interfere with this hospital, Avery added, you can explain yourselves to the War Office. Cole read the notice and withdrew his men to the West Wing. Eleanor immediately entered the house. Dr. Mercer met her near the crowded infirmary. We lost 2 this morning. 17 remain critical. Food? 5 days. Medicine? Colonel Wycliffe returned part of the recovered shipment. Through the window, Eleanor watched crates being unloaded, the same supplies Percival had diverted while men starved. Then a soldier noticed her. Her Grace is back. Men appeared at doors and windows. some bandaged, others standing with crutches. One raised his cap, another followed. God save the woman who saved us. The courtyard erupted. Eleanor stood motionless. Julian had sent her here believing her a coward. Now soldiers were cheering her name. A carriage rolled through the gates while the sound was still rising. Julian stepped down. The cheering slowly faded. One young soldier asked, "You here for the Duchess, sir?" Julian looked across the courtyard at Eleanor. "I am her husband." The silence that followed was far crueler than any insult. Minutes later, Eleanor faced him inside the library. "You came. You said my signature was forged." She placed Percival's authorization before him. "Did you sign this?" Julian read it. "No, I signed one document granting Percival limited authority to raise wartime funds." "And where is that original?" "With Percival." Eleanor gave a bitter laugh. "I trusted him," Julian said, "and refused to trust me." "Eleanor, no. Our marriage can wait until the wounded men outside are safe." She pushed the warehouse invoices toward him. Julian's face changed as he followed the transactions. "He resold military supplies? After Ashbourne paid for them? That is impossible. I watched those supplies being recovered from his warehouse." Julian sank into a chair. For the first time, Eleanor watched him understand that Percival's crimes had been enabled by his own choices. Julian had dismissed her warnings, removed her from the accounts, and granted another man authority because admitting she might be right had wounded his pride. "I signed the first loan," he admitted. "How much?" £20,000. Eleanor stared at him. "That money never appeared in the estate accounts." Julian said nothing. He had never checked. Before Eleanor could respond, Avery entered carrying a leather portfolio. "Colonel Wycliffe has arrived from London." He placed a large ledger on the table. They found Percival's second set of accounts. Eleanor opened it. Military goods had been purchased, diverted, resold, and divided into private profits. Percival's initials appeared beside enormous payments. P.V. Then another set appeared. J.A. Julian Ashbourne. Julian went pale. "I never received that money." Eleanor studied the entries rather than his face. Beside each supposed payment to Julian was another name, the person who had collected the money on his behalf. She recognized it immediately. Mr. Nathan Crane, Hawthorne's assistant steward. The man Eleanor had allowed to move freely through the estate because he had served the Ashbourne family for years. Avery's expression changed. "He is here. He was this morning." They rushed from the library. Crane was no longer in his office. His desk drawers had been emptied, and his horse was missing from the stable. Then Margaret came running from the infirmary. "Your Grace!" Eleanor turned. Margaret was holding a small brown medicine bottle. "Dr. Mercer says this was found beside the soldiers' drinking water." Eleanor took it and smelled the contents. Her blood went cold. It was not medicine. Crane had not merely fled. Before leaving Hawthorne, he had tried to silence the very soldiers who could prove what Percival had done. Eleanor carried the bottle directly to Dr. Mercer. He placed one drop onto a porcelain dish, smelled it, then looked at her. "Belladonna." Julian went pale. "How much?" "Enough in that bottle to kill several men." Eleanor immediately ordered every water jug, medicine bottle, and food container in Hawthorne inspected. No soldier was allowed to consume anything until Mercer approved it. Fortunately, the contaminated water had been discovered before anyone drank from it. Captain Avery returned from the stable. "Crane left less than an hour ago, took the east road." "That leads toward London," Julian said. "Or Ashbourne Junction," Eleanor replied. "The evening mail coach stops there." Avery understood immediately. "I'll take 6 men. I am coming." Julian stepped forward. "Eleanor? He knows the accounts. I need him alive. And Percival needs him dead." Their eyes met. Julian finally nodded. "I'm coming too." They reached Ashbourne Junction shortly before sunset. The mail coach was preparing to leave. Crane was nowhere on the platform. Then Avery noticed a rider disappearing behind the freight sheds. There! 2 soldiers cut him off while Avery approached from the opposite direction. Crane abandoned his horse and ran, but Julian tackled him before he reached the road. When Eleanor arrived, Crane was pinned against the ground. "Where is Percival?" she demanded. "I don't know." She showed him the ledger. His face changed. "You collected money under my husband's initials." "Lord Vane ordered it. You attempted to poison wounded soldiers." "No. Belladonna was found beside their water after you fled." Crane's resistance vanished. "Vane said nobody would die." Eleanor stared at him. "You put poison beside drinking water." "He told me it would make several men ill, nothing more." "He needed the hospital discredited before the creditors arrived." Julian grabbed Crane by the coat. "Why?" "Because if Hawthorne became recognized as a military hospital, seizure would become difficult." Julian looked sickened. Everything returned to the same fact. Eleanor's success had become a threat to Percival. "Where is the original authorization?" Eleanor asked. Crane remained silent. Avery tightened his grip. "Answer her." "At Vane House." "And the real correspondence?" "In Percival's study. There is a locked cabinet behind the eastern bookcase." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Avery. Finally, a surviving witness knew where the documents were. Then Crane whispered, "But you're too late." Eleanor turned back. "What do you mean?" "Lord Vane left London this morning." "For where?" Crane looked at Julian. "Ashbourne Castle." Julian froze. "Why?" "To destroy the original estate accounts before the War Office seized them." Eleanor's mind moved faster than her fear. The estate accounts contained years of genuine signatures and transactions, the perfect comparison against Percival's forged documents. "How long ago did he leave?" "Nearly 12 hours. Julian started toward the horses. "We ride now." Crane laughed bitterly. "You still don't understand." Eleanor stopped. "What else?" "Percival knows the Duchess found the warehouse." His eyes shifted toward her. "He doesn't intend merely to burn the ledgers." A cold silence settled over the platform. "He sent men to Hawthorne before he left London." Avery's face hardened. "We just came from Hawthorne." Crane shook his head. "They weren't supposed to arrive until after dark." Eleanor turned toward the road. More than 100 wounded soldiers were still inside that house, and night was less than an hour away. They rode back toward Hawthorne at full speed. Smoke was already rising beyond the trees. Eleanor's stomach dropped. No. She drove her horse harder. When Hawthorne appeared, flames were climbing from the old stable beside the west wing. Servants carried buckets while wounded soldiers dragged themselves toward the courtyard. Avery immediately took command of the soldiers. Eleanor ran toward Margaret. "The patients? Most are outside. 6 cannot walk. Get wagons beneath the east windows." Julian caught her arm. "The fire is spreading. Then help me." She pulled free. Together, they entered the smoke-filled corridor. Julian carried one unconscious soldier, while Eleanor and 2 servants supported another. By the time the last patient reached the courtyard, part of the stable roof had collapsed. But the main house remained standing. Colonel Wycliffe arrived with soldiers minutes later and surrounded 3 men attempting to escape across the kitchen garden. One carried a bottle, smelling strongly of lamp oil. Another had Percival's written instructions in his coat. Julian read the order. His face emptied. "Burn the western stores. Remove vain correspondence. Make the loss appear accidental. You gave him power over my estates, Eleanor said quietly. He used it to steal from soldiers, mortgage my home, and now burn the evidence with wounded men inside. Julian stared at the flames. I know. No, Julian, you are only beginning to know. He did not defend himself. By midnight, the fire was controlled. No soldiers had died, though 3 servants suffered burns. More importantly, Percival's men were alive to testify. Wycliffe approached Eleanor. Crane has agreed to give a formal statement in exchange for consideration. Then we finally have the chain. The colonel nodded. The forged authorization, warehouse invoices, the secret ledger, Crane's payments, the attempted poisoning, and now Percival's written order. Julian looked toward the road, but Percival himself is still free, and destroying the original estate accounts, Eleanor said. They could not remain at Hawthorne. Eleanor placed Dr. Mercer in charge of the hospital, while Wycliffe left soldiers to guard the property. The creditors' representatives, having witnessed the arson attempt, refused to remove anything until the disputed documents were reviewed. For the moment, Hawthorne was safe. Before dawn, Eleanor, Julian, Avery, and Wycliffe departed for Ashbourne Castle. They arrived shortly after sunrise. The great doors stood open. No servants greeted them. Eleanor entered first. A smell she recognized instantly filled the corridor. Burned paper. They ran toward the estate office. The door had been forced open, and the fireplace overflowed with blackened account books. Julian stared at the ashes. He destroyed them. Eleanor knelt beside the hearth. Not everything had burned. Beneath a fallen grate lay several scorched pages. She carefully lifted one. It contained payments bearing Percival's name. Then Avery called from behind the desk. Your Grace. A hidden drawer had been opened. Inside was a sealed bundle of letters. The top letter was addressed to Nathan Crane. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Percival, and its first sentence revealed that the fraud had begun almost a year before Eleanor was banished. Someone had been planning her removal long before Julian ordered her away. Eleanor opened the first letter. Crane. Her Grace continues examining the supply accounts. Encourage Ashbourne's belief that her objections come from fear rather than competence. Once she is removed, the contracts will proceed without interference. Eleanor read it twice. Percival had deliberately turned Julian's pride against her. But the discovery did not absolve her husband. Percival had manipulated him. Julian had chosen to believe him. There are more, Avery said. The letters documented almost everything: payments to Crane, instructions to divert supplies, plans to forge Julian's authorization, and repeated demands to keep Eleanor away from the estate books. Julian stood motionless. He wanted me to send you away, and you did. You believed what protected your pride. Julian lowered his eyes. Yes, it was the first time he admitted it without excuse. Wycliffe gathered the letters with the surviving account pages. This is enough for the War Office. 2 days later, a formal inquiry opened in London. Percival appeared with counsel, still insisting that Julian had authorized every transaction. Then Eleanor entered carrying the brass dispatch cylinder Quartermaster Bell had died protecting. Behind her came Captain Avery, Colonel Wycliffe, Dr. Mercer, Crane under guard, and several soldiers from Hawthorne. As Eleanor crossed the chamber, one wounded sergeant rose with difficulty. Her Grace saved my life. Another soldier stood, then another. Within moments, nearly every soldier in the gallery was on his feet. The woman Julian had publicly called a coward now stood surrounded by men who had survived because of her. Percival's expression finally changed. Eleanor presented the evidence in order: Bell's diversion notice, the warehouse invoices, the forged authorization dated while Julian was provably at Ashbourne, the secret profit ledger, Crane's testimony, the belladonna, the arson instructions. Finally, she opened Percival's letters describing how he had engineered her removal. "You did not merely steal from my family," Eleanor said. "You stole food and medicine from soldiers at war, then attempted to destroy the people who could prove it." Percival rose suddenly, and the Duke signed the authority that made everything possible. The room went silent. Eleanor looked at Julian. This was the moment he could hide behind Percival's crimes. Instead, Julian stood. "He is right about one thing." Percival smiled. Julian continued. "I gave him authority, despite my wife's warnings. I removed her from the accounts because she challenged me publicly. I called caution cowardice because admitting she was right wounded my pride." The smile vanished from Percival's face. Julian turned toward the commissioners. "Lord Vane committed the fraud, but my arrogance gave him the opportunity." Eleanor said nothing. An admission was not redemption. The inquiry had yet to decide what each man would lose. Then the chief commissioner opened one final document recovered from Percival's cabinet. His expression darkened. "This concerns Hawthorne Grange." Eleanor leaned forward. The commissioner looked directly at her. "Your Grace, it appears Lord Vane did more than mortgage your residence. He attempted to transfer legal control of the property entirely, and the document carried Julian's genuine signature." Eleanor examined the genuine signature beneath the transfer. Julian did not deny it. "What did you believe you were signing?" she asked. "A temporary security agreement. Percival said it would protect Hawthorne from wartime creditors. You signed away control of the house you had sent me to without reading the final terms." Julian closed his eyes. Yes, that single choice completed Percival's scheme. He had needed Eleanor removed because she understood the accounts. Once Julian banished her, Percival diverted military supplies, resold them through his warehouse, forged additional authorizations, and used Crane to collect profits under Julian's initials. When Eleanor transformed Hawthorne into a hospital and began uncovering the missing provisions, Percival accelerated the property seizure, attempted to poison witnesses, and finally ordered the hospital burned. The commissioners withdrew. When they returned, Percival Vane was taken into custody pending prosecution for fraud, forgery, theft of military provisions, conspiracy, and the attempts to destroy evidence. Crane's cooperation spared him the harshest recommendation, but he remained under criminal prosecution. Julian faced a different reckoning. The commission cleared him of participating in Percival's theft. It did not clear him of responsibility for enabling it. Julian stood publicly before the officers and soldiers. "My wife warned me that provisions were missing. I dismissed her because I valued my pride more than her judgment. I called her a coward and removed her from our affairs. Men suffered because I gave authority to someone she had already taught me to question." He turned toward Eleanor. "You were not disloyal to me. I was disloyal to you." Eleanor accepted the truth without offering forgiveness. Over the following weeks, Julian sold 2 of his personal properties to satisfy legitimate debts and replace money lost through the fraudulent contracts. He withdrew from his government appointment and formally revoked every authority he had granted Percival. Most importantly, he executed a new settlement, placing Hawthorne beyond his personal control. The property and its income became Eleanor's for life. Only after that document was registered did Eleanor agree to see him privately. Julian came to Hawthorne without servants or ceremony. "I want you to return to Ashbourne," he said. Eleanor looked toward the windows, where recovering soldiers walked slowly through the gardens. You once ordered me out of your house because I embarrassed you. I know. You do not get to invite me back and call that repair. His face tightened, but he nodded. What do you want from me? Nothing. The answer surprised him. I want the freedom to decide what happens next, without depending upon your regret. Julian lowered his head. You have it. Months passed. Hawthorne became a permanent convalescent home, supported by recovered funds and military grants, with Eleanor overseeing its accounts and medical supply network. One spring morning, a regiment returning from service passed through the village. The soldiers stopped outside Hawthorne. Eleanor walked through the gates. Captain Avery raised his hat. The Duchess of Ashbourne. Hundreds of voices answered. Our Savior. Julian stood far behind them. This time, he did not step forward to claim a place beside her. He simply removed his hat. Eleanor saw him. She did not turn away, but neither did she cross the distance between them. Months earlier, Julian had decided where she belonged and ordered her there. Now Eleanor turned back toward Hawthorne, took the keys from her pocket, and opened its gates herself.